Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 40 Minutes with Adam Posen. I'm Edoardo Campanella, the director of the UniCredit Investment Institute. We are in the middle of an unprecedented trade war, and I cannot think of a better person than Adam to understand how the global economy and the global trading system will evolve. Adam is one of the most prominent economist in the world. He graduated from Harvard, worked for a variety of institutions, both in the US and in Europe. In 2009, he joined the Bank of England as an external member of its Monetary Policy Committee. And since 2013, he has been the charismatic president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics in DC. So, Adam, welcome to the UniCredit Investment Institute.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's a pleasure to be with you. I can't match you in either charm or scholarship, so I appreciate the generous introduction.
Thanks. So, Adam, you recently wrote a very influential article for Foreign Affairs. The title of his article is The New Economic Geography. It's an article that I strongly recommend to all the people who are watching us today. In this article, you describe the post-American world order. Can you tell us how this new world will look like in 2028 when the Trump presidency will come to an end, and assuming he will not run for a third mandate?
Thank you, Edo. I think we can put some pretty big brackets on the uncertainty. I think that the world in 2028 will be a world in which there is less centrality of the dollar. The dollar will still be a reserve currency, but over the next 3 years, there will be a lot of large investment pools, including sovereign wealth funds, that will be at the margin not reinvesting in dollars and investing in other things, and we can discuss what those are. I think that US will have created a very Swiss cheese filled with holes Fortress America, which the UK, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and to some degree Mexico will be part of, unwillingly for the most part, but they will be part of. I think there will be huge new opportunities for both Europe and China, and potentially ASEAN, not just in trade. And I think that's one of the main messages of my article, is that people are focused understandably on the trade war. It's very dramatic, it does matter, it's very new, but it's part of a more general shift that the Trump administration is accelerating that has implications for foreign direct investment, for the dollar, as I mentioned. It's a reallocation of a lot of burdens that I talk about, people having to self-insure, businesses, foreign governments. The final point I would make, Eduardo, is that there is uncertainty still, and a lot of that, frankly, is up to Europe. Europe has a lot more agency and control not to put the world back the way it was, but to decide how good a world it's going to be for Europe and countries associated with it. And that's still to play for.
So thanks a lot. You basically sketch out the key insights of your article, and we will pick on them throughout our conversation. But before we get there, I would like to allow you to explain us better the argument that you put out in your piece. In this article, you essentially states that the US used to be the global insurer, and it has now turned into an extractor of profits. What do you mean by that? Why it is important to understand how the world is evolving in the direction that you just sketch out?
Yeah. So it's not a formal economic model, but I think it's a useful way to conceive of the situation, Eduardo. I think the US broadly since the late 40s has been the global insurer. It provided naval forces so people and air forces so people could engage in international commerce with almost no risk of piracy, not even having to think about it. It provided a rule of law and various courts and legal systems that were not universal, but which set a standard in which others could go to. One could argue they were a little biased towards the US or biased towards intellectual property holders, but they did provide this rule of law. Obviously, trade, US was the consumer of last resort, but also engaged for the most part in a rules-based system. And of course, the dollar, it gave people a place to park money where they could get in and out without affecting the pricing, and where generally, even in bad times, the dollar held value, and the treasury market was liquid, and many other things. But all of these things, I think, should be thought of as a win-win. The US was essentially a property and casualty insurer. It was charging a premium, particularly to allies in Europe, in East Asia, on the borders of the US, that they would hold excessive amounts of dollars, invest excessive amounts in the US of products, accede to the US on various standards, whether in foreign policy and security or in certain kinds of cultural and technical issues, overhold the dollar, obviously, and be ready to garrison US troops and pay for them hard, as they do in Japan, Germany, and elsewhere, in Korea. This was win-win because it removed a lot of risk for particularly people in Europe and East Asia, but throughout the world, and even for China. And these premia were there and made it in the US interest as well, in addition to being just enlightened, the right thing to do. I think the Trump administration has come in very explicitly and argued repeatedly, and some on the left in the US have also said this, that the US instead has not been profiting from this, that free riding Japan, Germany, Italy, UK, Canada, whoever, has been ripping off the US. The US has been played for a sucker. The trade system is stacked against the US. All of this is demonstrably false, but it's very strongly believed by the Trump administration, by a lot of people in Congress in both parties, and by a meaningful but not majority portion of the US electorate. The real problem, though, is they're not going back as an insurer would and saying, we need to up our premium. Global warming's here, hurricanes are here. We need to increase the premium a bit. And then letting the customers decide whether they were going to continue to buy coverage. They've gone to insurance in the way it's called in US gangster movies, or a protection racket. They say, you have a nice little economy here. Would be a shame if anything happened to it. You should pay me. And if you don't pay me a lot to keep me from hurting you, I'm just going to cut the insurance. And that's no way to behave. But what that means is that's the reality. And so this is why people around the world are now talking about forms of self-insurance. A final point, what the Trump people don't seem to get, what all the people pushing this point of view don't seem to get, is that they're not the same as Chubb or Liberty Mutual or the comparable European property and casualty insurer. It's because when the US provided these forms of economic and national security, it actually reduced the risk. If a property insurer provides insurance against climate change, it doesn't actually reduce the risk. So people can self-insure, which is already more expensive, but it also means the risks are higher.
So thanks a lot. You already mentioned this argument that I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this. One reason why Trump and his administration are repudiating this role of global insurers because they keep arguing that the US has been ripped off by both allies and rivals for more than 50 years. How would you counter their argument? How would you explain that these security guarantees were actually beneficial for the US, also in economic terms, not just from a national security perspective?
And thank you for putting up that clip. I mean, there are many others, but that's perfect. And it is very strange, I think, for other people around the world to hear this, because if you're garrisoning troops in Germany or Italy or the UK or Japan, Okinawa in Japan or Korea, you're paying an awful burden to enable the US to have forward placement of troops, which means that the US has a secure cordon way away from its shores. If you are putting disproportionate amounts of money into dollars because disproportionate sense versus US share of world trade, US share of world GDP, and that is subsidizing US interest rates to a huge degree. And you can always try to make these crazy arguments that that somehow is on net bad for the US because it means the dollar is overvalued. And the UK tried to make those kinds of arguments occasionally about the City of London, but it doesn't really hold up to scrutiny because the benefits of a strong dollar on average and the benefits of stable, lower interest rates are enormous. You also have the fact that the trade deficits are not necessarily a sign of harm, which is, of course, one of the fundamental economic things that a lot of people, including in the Trump administration, including Congress, just refuse to accept. And it's, as a macroeconomist, and I know you see things this way as well, we have trade deficits in the US because there are more investment opportunities in the US that people from around the world want than we have savings to fill. That's why we have a trade deficit. And that's why all this trade war stuff isn't going to make much difference. It might make a tiny bit, but it isn't going to make much difference to the US trade deficit. And that's a good thing. It's, again, a win-win to have people getting higher returns on their investment and the US reaching opportunities it couldn't otherwise have. And as I've argued, and then Barry Eichengreen and co-authors did in a more sophisticated way, that feeds back and forth with the national security. Part of the reason people peg to the dollar, overuse the dollar, is the security relationships. That's why Saudi Arabia uses the dollar. That's why Taiwan uses the dollar. On a geographic or trade basis, you wouldn't be using the dollar. So the whole bundle is actually very beneficial, or I should say was very beneficial for the US.
So I'm not sure you agree with the term neo-mercantilism, but in a way we are entering into a more neo-mercantilist world where corporate power and political power are fusing in unprecedented ways. For example, Trump's decision to take a stake into Intel, for example. Clearly, the rebirth of industrial policy is not something that has happened now with Trump. It's something that it's a trend that started with the Biden administration. Do you agree that there is a need for the state to play a more intrusive role in the economy? And do you think the Trump administration is taking the right path in this sense?
I very much agree with your initial characterization. I wouldn't necessarily call it neo-mercantilist, or I might prefer neo-corporatist, but the basic idea that for the US and for a lot of other countries, the barrier between government intervention and specific companies and markets is being willfully taken down. And you're absolutely right. Trump won, Biden in particular administration, and others have engaged in this. I think we need to unpack it. There is a legitimate concern that economists, including myself, had paid too little attention to, which is what we call concentration risk. The idea that you're totally dependent on China for magnets and rare earths, or you're totally dependent on Taiwan for a certain kind of semiconductor chip. And the idea that you, for national security reasons as well as economic reasons, have to do something about that is reasonable. But that is not the same as thinking that therefore the government should take stakes in things and that everything should be produced at home or forcibly extorted away from other countries and other companies. So I think you need to have, I can't remember the term used, but a decisive or a strong intervention, but it doesn't need to be a large intervention. So for example, if we wanted to have enough steel production in the US to cover needs that we don't have to get steel from China, the amount of steel required for our total defense needs is actually quite low as a share of total world market. And previously, Canadian and Mexican production were particularly Canadian, obviously, were considered part of the US defense space. And so there are better and worse ways of doing it once you recognize the concentration risks are real and it's worth some economic interference to do that. The other point, which goes back again to where you started with neo-mercantilist or neo-corporatist, is the issue of, when is it a good idea for government to be involved? And so the latest excuse we have is, whether it's Intel or NVIDIA or whoever, or Pfizer now in pharmaceuticals, that this means the government gets some of the upside equity if something good happens. You can get that through taxes, and it's far less distortionary, because it shouldn't be that you need if the companies make profits, it shouldn't matter how they make the profits. The government then gets its fair share legislated by the Congress of what the profits are. And so it would be much better if we invested in public goods it's a very tired phrase, but it's real, R&D, government-supported research, workforce flexibility, high-skilled migration into the U.S., training programs, infrastructure for energy. And some of that will, of course, go to private companies, but the U.S. government taking equity stakes and directing private company money is just plain stupid.
So yeah, I think most of our viewers agree with this view, and probably also here in Europe, we don't really know how to react and counter-react to this degeneration in industrial policy. We were already struggling with more orthodox industrial policies that were adopted by the Biden administration, even if they were highly discriminatory. It's even more difficult to adapt to this new model of industrial policy. But talking about the trade war and protectionism, because providing funding or adopting favorable regulation for specific industries, specific companies is one way to support them through neo-mercantilist or neo-corporatist policies, call it the way you prefer. But also protecting specific industry from foreign competition is another way to pursue the same goal. Trump used to say that trade wars are easy to win. You wrote a few months ago another important article, still for Foreign Affairs, where you were making the opposite argument. The trade wars are easy to lose. And in particular, you emphasize this idea of escalation dominance for Beijing, and you argue that actually Beijing is well positioned to wage this trade war. Can you explain us what you mean by escalation dominance and why China, in your opinion, might win the trade war in the end?
Thank you again, Edo. You've been very gracious to refer to my past work, which I'm glad has had an impact. So the basic idea of escalation dominance comes from discussions in the Cold War, including in what was then the Central Front in Europe, planning against the Warsaw Pact. And the idea of escalation dominance is that at any given level of struggle, if the military struggle, the attacks become more serious, like you go from border skirmishes to real incursions, you go from incursions to missiles to nuclear, God forbid, missiles. The idea being that one party probably in a lot of situations is able to win at each level. And I took that concept to trade wars, and in particular for China, China is able to do that to the US. Despite the fact a trade war hurts China, no question. They'd rather not have a trade war with China. They'd rather have access to the US market. But the US as the importer on net and as the exporter of higher end goods and branded goods and intellectual property based goods is asymmetrically vulnerable to China. If China loses all US trade in the extreme, it loses money. but it loses very few inputs it can't substitute for in a national security or in a basic economic production sense. In the US, it's the opposite. We lose critical inputs to pharmaceutical products, to low-end semiconductor chips that you can use in all kinds of cars and appliances and everything, which China dominates. Magnets and rare earths, we already mentioned. And we can't replace these easily, not in a short amount of time. And so we don't lose money, we lose shortages. We get shortages in addition to money. So China has escalation dominance. And then you can get into all the politics why China can do that. But the important point is Secretary of the Treasury Bissett, said, we're holding all the cards. And I publicly published this article saying, no, you're not. And then, of course, he folded, as the expression is, like a cheap suit when China put up the rare earths barriers, the export controls. So, as I say in this article, if you're worried about a large, in national security terms, like in the Cold War Europe, you were worried about the Warsaw Pact, invading the Fulda Gap in Germany with tanks. The way you try to reduce that risk is you build up counterforces, and you don't just decide you're going to preemptively attack them when you don't have the strength. Similarly, and this is the thing the Biden administration got wrong as well, you want to do a trade war for whatever reason, well, at least ahead of time, make deals with other countries so you have alternative sources of supply, stockpile the things you need, prepare your companies and your public for it, think through what they can do to you. Don't just start saying, I'm the US, I can do anything, because frankly, you can't.
So in a way, if I can summarize your argument, it's premature, the trade war, and it is a little bit improvised in the sense that the US is actually not ready to wage it. I think it's important, since we are talking about China, to stick to China for a moment, because essentially all the transformation that we are seeing happening in the world right now, also with Biden, were in a way a reaction to China's rise. So I think it's important if we stick to it for a moment. Both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have adopted pretty confrontational policies against China, further antagonizing Beijing. We might discuss whether the engagement strategy of the early 2000s was a wise strategy or not. But if you had the opportunity to advise the US president, what sort of China strategy would you recommend him to pursue?
Thank you, Edo. I do think, and I was pretty loud about this during the Biden administration as well, that as usual, the wrong points of attack were being chosen for the wrong reasons. And so in a sense, actually, the Biden administration was more aggressive than the Trump administration. Not obviously on the tariff level being imposed. Clearly, the Trump people have put on huge tariffs on China as well as on others. But in terms of overt hostility and threats in the national security sphere and threats on investment, Trump has fluctuated back and forth. At times he said, we don't want any Chinese investment in the US. At times he said, well, we want plenty of Chinese investment in the US as long as you put it where I tell you to put it and give me a cut. And I think in the end, we're going to see Trump reach an accommodation with China that isn't necessarily great, but is better than what we've been seeing for the last 5, 6, 7 years. It's not going to produce the results in terms of trade surpluses shrinking that Biden or Trump say they wanted, but it probably will be accompanied by some military-to-military communication and just tone down the level of intensity of the conflict, which I think is the right thing to do because China exists. It's allowed to exist. You can't do anything about its existence. Now, this doesn't absolve China of various ways in which it cheated, quote unquote, in trade and other things. So I and my colleagues at Peterson, particularly Nick Lardy, Morris Goldstein, Fred Bergston, Joe Gagnon, were very out there in the early 2000s saying all this trade stuff with China is one thing, but you're letting China get away with massive manipulation of the currency. And I would argue that that was actually a huge part of the China shock, as it's called, was that they were allowed to manipulate the currency at very great extent for several years up through the global financial crisis. And we should have been more aggressive on that. There was an opportunity at the late in the first Trump administration, which could have been revived early in the first Biden administration, that US, EU, and Japanese trade negotiators and people at the WTO were working on a subsidies code that would have put an allied front to confront China on its behavior with unfair subsidies in various industries. And my colleague at Peterson now, Cecilia Malmström from Sweden, was the EU trade negotiator at the time, and she managed with her Japanese and her American counterpart at the time, Robert Lighthizer, to have in 2019 a very realistic, reasonable proposal, which Trump killed. I'm not quite sure why, since Lighthizer was willing to do it. So anyway, there were various opportunities to confront China on specific issues where they really were doing harm. But in the end, reality is reality, and China's cheating is not the reason China has risen, and is not the reason manufacturing employment has declined in the US, and is not the reason we have trade deficits. And so we have this crazy mismatch, and it's very much an inside Washington thing in both parties, that there's this obsession with China. But one interesting thing I would flag for you very short term, is there's a committee in Congress, which I don't remember what its official title is, but it's basically the We Hate China Committee. It's a real committee, and it is one of the few committees where Democrats and Republicans agree in Congress. And they've been very hostile and much more wanting aggressive approaches economically to China. They suddenly went as a group to visit Beijing and met with very senior officials in Beijing and came out talking reasonable points of view, which I'm glad of. But I also view that as a sign that, as on everything else, Congress is capitulating to Trump, and Trump's getting ready to make a deal. And so even this committee that was sort of the hub of the China hawks in Washington has moved to a more accommodationist point of view.
So thanks, Adams. And I think we could have an entire session on this. But one of the advantages of interviewing someone as prolific as you is that it's pretty easy to find among your past writings something that is still relevant today and interesting. A couple of years ago, you argued that China was experiencing what you call the long economic COVID. At the very beginning of this interview, you said that China might benefit from this inward-looking strategy that the Trump administration is undertaking. However, I wonder whether you still believe that the Chinese economy is in a weak position, and if that's the case, how you can reconcile that with this idea that China can maybe not take over, but certainly gain influence in the system, given what Washington is doing.
Yeah, thank you, Edo. Again, thank you for linking it together, because at least in my head, it links together. So it's gratifying you think some of it links together too. The important point, which is true for China, true for US, arguably true for Europe as a whole, and for India, for a few very large economies, is that they're very large, very diverse economies, and the fundamental determinants of their outcomes are domestic, not international. Most other economies in the world are small, starting with the UK, starting with South Korea, and working your way down in size, are small, open economies, and that's not true. The international situation is first order. But for this handful of economies, and again, Europe, it varies, but it is true. So like in the US right now, you can have terrible external policies from Trump and frankly bad other policies. But because the AI sector is so vibrant and has certain real advantages, because the energy situation is pretty ample, because the US, even though it's shooting itself hugely in the foot, the leg, and the stomach over research and universities and so on, and skilled immigration, for the moment still has great resources. Anyway, you can have a messed up international approach and still have this vibrant part of the US economy. And the same is true in reverse for China. You can have a really messed up domestic economy, which I would argue they still have, but still have opportunities that economic diplomacy, judicious investment, behavior by the rules, and certain kinds of flows, management of certain kinds of flows of capital and people and business can play to your advantage. And so I would emphasize that China is still in trouble. You see that even with their massive export of the net exports of the last couple of years, when having shifted away, lost a huge amount of U.S. markets, they still have a pretty lackluster domestic demand, lackluster consumption, lackluster small business. And even in today's China, that's the bulk of the economy. I mean, consumption is 45 to 50% and would be much of GDP, and it would be much better for the Chinese people, not just the rest of the world. And the Politburo acknowledges this, that it was more like 60% majority domestic consumption that as the economy, and services as the economy. And we're not getting that. The real thing I would emphasize is what I would call the word might, that China might be able to take advantage of this. And I don't, to the extent that they rely excessively on exports for growth, there will be resentment and barriers, as has gone up in Europe to some degree. Developing countries have less choice about that. My colleague at Peterson, Arvind Subramanian, has a talk about this coming up on Thursday this week at PIAE. You can view it online. But anyway, it will offset some of their opportunities. But if they do things like they did recently, giving up special and differential treatment as a less developed economy at the WTO, making professions with some backing through the rules-based system, letting people come train in China the way the US may not let people come train in the US. There are a lot of things they can do to get ahead in the world despite having domestic problems economically. Again, if you're a big, diverse economy, India, US, China, maybe Japan, maybe Europe in some ways, you can have this divergence between what your domestic strengths are and your international strengths are.
So thanks, Adam. Adam is in high demand, so immediately after this interview, he will have another interview. I think we have roughly 10 more minutes. So for those of you who are watching us, if you want to drop a question in the chat, I will be happy to read it aloud for Adam. In the meantime, I have one question for you, Adam, about Europe. We are a European bank, so it's good for us to have also perspective on this continent, even if you have mentioned Europe several times already. So, according to your analysis, the first article we discussed, probably the strategy that the Trump administration is adopting will be self-harming for the US. China might benefit from it, even with all the caveats we just discussed. What's the role of Europe? Europe, in your opinion, will be a junior partner of a US-led sphere of influence, or can carve out a more independent and autonomous role for itself?
My belief is very much the latter, Eduardo, that Europe is capable of carving out a much more independent role. It will not be a junior partner to U.S. dominance, or at least it's very unlikely to be.
And it's great to hear this from an American, because I think the perspective in Europe is much more pessimistic, to be honest. That it's good to.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you see it that way. And I and my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, some of whom are European, some of whom who are not, I think have a more objective and therefore somewhat more optimistic view about Europe than a lot of people, including in Europe. But I want to stress, like with China, it depends a lot on how Europe chooses to act. I think, and I was making this case at the European Central Bank roughly a month ago, I think if Europe accelerates its central bank digital currency and accelerates the access to it more directly, it could step in a lot to the role that the dollar has been playing. And it's not just that, providing swap lines, long-term encouraging banks within Europe and elsewhere to depend on euro liquidity rather than dollar liquidity. There's a whole range of things which President Lagarde and various members of the Governing Council have been talking about at the ECB, but I'm encouraging them to go further. Similarly, as my colleagues Jacob Kierkegaard, Olivier Blanchard, Angel Ubide have written about in various ways, including about Eurobonds, and we've been arguing for a long time in different ways, that, like the late Peter Kennan pointed out, the one of the real gaps in the euro was the lack of joint fiscal capacity, and the defense needs, as well as migrant management needs and green transition needs, give a real opportunity for Europe to lean into more joint fiscal action. And historically, Jacob and I did a report for the European Commission on this a few years ago. Historically, that's a large part of how countries' monetary unions gain stature and capacity. I mean, we trace that through the history of the U.S. So, and then obviously on trade, if Europe becomes the preferred partner, because there's a lot of reasons for third countries, including Europe, not to trust the Chinese. I mean, just the fact that the Americans are getting worse doesn't mean the Chinese are getting better as a trading partner. And so you can imagine a whole host of countries, including CPTPP, but also around the Med in Central Asia and in former colonies, sadly, but where there's real economic ties, like with Latin America and Spain and Portugal and Belgium. You can have leaning into being the trading partner of preference, and that will pay off in terms of foreign direct investment and setting of business standards and brands on all the ways the U.S. used to get disproportionately. The flip side of this is Europe has to be willing to accept a stronger currency and to not necessarily always be export-oriented, to be less neo-mercantilist. But I think the path is there for Europe, and it's, again, a win-win for Europe if it pursues it.
So, Adam, I think you have only 5 more minutes to stay with us, and I'm getting.
I have 10 to 12 more minutes.
Okay, that's great, because we are starting to get a lot of questions. Some of them might require some elaboration.
I'll try to be more brief in my responses. Sorry.
So the first question is from Giacomo. What is your view on the astonishing gold movement and how it is related to geopolitics?
I think it's very straightforward that people have been losing trust in government in a broad sense, as we've seen in the elections in Europe and the US and around the world, after the financial crisis, after COVID, after our polarized politics, in the US case, after the failed wars in Iraq and Iran. And they're also losing faith in the fiscal governance and the independence of central banks, which puts on more of an inflation risk. And they're also, depending on where you live, losing faith that you're going to be able to get in and out of the dollar or treasuries, let alone Chinese renminbi, easily, depending on your nationality. And so, I mean, as like any modern central banker, I think gold is a barbarous relic in Keynes's memorable phrase, but You're going to go to something else that you think is not going to be government controlled and won't depend on your citizenship and holds value no matter what the national security situation. So you go into gold, you go into small currencies like Norwegian, Swiss, Singaporean, Gulf states, New Zealand. You go into timber and silver and other natural resources. And if you're particularly a sucker, you go into cyber assets. But, I view it as totally endogenous, the rise of gold, and I have no way of assessing what the price should be because there's no fundamentals here, but just it is a somewhat logical response to the world we're in, the fundamental political changes of the world we're in.
The other question I have that might be more delicate is how permanent is the damage to the US democracy that Trump is causing? Do you think it's something transitory or something more permanent?
To be clear, I'm not a political scientist, though I have some political science training. So this is more based on who I choose to read, who is an expert. I think the damage is very fundamental and lasting. We have demonstrated in the US that institutions are not enough. It's norms and political enforcement that matter. And I actually warned about this in my dissertation 30 years ago. I didn't warn about Trump, but I warned about central bank independence, for example, needing political support. It's not enough to just declare an institution independent. And we've seen that with the Supreme Court. We've seen that with the US military. We've now seen that, starting to see that with the Fed. And so there's an increasing, not popular movement, but awareness that maybe France had the wrong idea to have 5 constitutions, but the US running on the same constitution essentially hasn't been changed in much since the Civil War 150, 160 years ago. I mean, women's suffrage, other things were important, but not fundamental constitutional change. Our Constitution needs to be reviewed. And in practical forecasting terms, the risk is if things go wrong economically or politically with Trump, that you get even more extreme parties or fractions of parties. The hopeful scenario is that there's a succession problem after Trump, whenever that is, and or that either the Democratic or Republican parties split and there becomes a centrist party that somehow becomes popular, which is hard to see from Europe's perspective right now. But the damage is lasting, and the damage is lasting on the international front as well. I mean, if you think of what Germany and Japan had to do after the war to reestablish trust, this isn't quite the same, but it's in a similar genre. It would take, treaties are being ignored. Longstanding commitments and alliances are being perverted. So why should people believe the next commitment from the US government, unless it's very narrow and monitored, but even then. So yeah, I think the damage, unfortunately, is quite lasting.
So I really appreciate your openness on this topic. 2 more questions and then I let you go because I think you need at least to drink a glass of water before you move to the other event. Okay, that's great. So one question is from France, who's asking, what is your view about the quality of US economic data given the shutdown and the issue with the BLS, and if you want, I can also read you the last one, that is a big one, so you know how to manage your time, calibrate your time. Is from Roberto, and is asking, what's the future of the WTO in this system that is emerging?
So first on the data, this is obviously very concerning. Colleagues of mine at the Peterson Institute, including Karen Dynan, David Wilcox, and especially Jed Kolko, all of whom have served in various U.S. government roles having to oversee data production or served on it, and also have since served on advisory committees and public committees on U.S. data. We're very concerned. People shouldn't be focused on the shutdown and the missing a couple weeks of data. That's unfortunate and stupid, but it's not really the issue. The issue is more that the Trump administration is destroying the basic infrastructure of unbiased data collection. They're driving out senior civil servants, not just in economic data, but in climate data, in astronomical data, in geological data, in health data in a big way. They're driving out the senior civil servants. They're politicizing the leadership. They're changing the standards. They're challenging the veracity of the data. And so we have to, so far, it's been bad, but but the underlying data has still been getting. I seem to be freezing a bit. Finally, on WTO.
Yeah.
Finally, on WTO.
Yeah, you are back.
Yeah. Thank you. Finally, on WTO, we work a lot with the WTO at Peterson with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the very good Director General who leads it. Colleagues of mine like Alan Wolf, Chad Bown, Mary Lovely, Cecilia Malmstrom, who I mentioned previously, Arvind Subramanian, others are very active. My view, which I've expressed at the WTO and to WTO ministers, is you have to move forward in a plurilateralist rather than multilateral way, but still in a multilateral rules-based spirit. And I totally support another thing that Ngozi very much pushes, which is the WTO is very useful to its members, and very useful to particularly its developing country members, and to small businesses and women-owned businesses. This is all true. You can argue over how big a deal it is, how much you care, but it's all true. And so I think that there are ways forward for the WTO, but you have to basically give up on the multilateral rounds. You have to give up on letting India and the US and Brazil and China veto things. You have to encourage plurilateral regional industry-based deals that are dealt with the WTO. And you have to think about the WTO, which I know they're doing, and I have some other ideas for another occasion, but think about the WTO as a service provider as much as a rules or negotiating organization. And if we do all that, WTO will continue to be useful and help trade around the world for those who are willing to play along, and it'll be there to be revived when someday the world comes to its senses.
So, Adam, thanks a lot. I have a long list of questions coming from the audience. I think that's a good reason to invite you again in the future. So thanks a lot.
You've been amazing, Ido. Thank you and UniCredit for this opportunity, and I would love to engage further with your audience. I'm sorry if I was too long-winded.
No. It was great. Thanks a lot for your insightful answer, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
The night's electric, we're cruising.